And welcome back to Serving the Servant by Danny Goldberg, remembering Kurt Cobain, ready by Bradley Dahlberg in 2024. Yeah, buddy. Oh shit. Readjust shit. Up to chapter 3. Sub Pop. Poppin'. It's poppin'. In Seattle, an hour drive away from Olympia, Sub Pop Records would initially emulate K, but would eventually prove to be more flexible when it came to the dealings with the music business. Evergreen's alumnus, Bruce Pavitt, had originally called his KOAS radio show and related fanzine Subterranean Pop before shortening the name. Once he moved to Seattle, Pavitt and his partner Jonathan Poneman became entrepreneurs who had as much in common with Ben and Jerry as they did with Kay. The Sub Pop was created in 1988 and adopted its slogan, World Domination. Poneman's business card read, Corporate Lackey, and Pavitt's Corporate Magnet. They presented themselves as both businessmen and rebels who had made fun of themselves and posed work. Kurt pursued Sub Pop relentlessly, and Courtney told me that he wanted them because at the beginning he wanted to be. Soundgarden, and they got on Sub Pop first. Kurt soon wore Poneman and Pavitt down, and they let Nirvana record some singles for the label. Ribbit. The band immediately stood out, and in part because of Kurt's voice, also due to the fearless physicality on stage. Jumping from any available scaffolding onto the stage or into the audience was an unrestrained abandon. Kurt charmed everyone at the label. Gina Body, who did the publicity for Sub Pop, shared an apartment with Susie Tennant, the local radio promotion person for Geffen Records. And one of our singular aspects of the Seattle rock community at the time was that the people felt more connected to one another than any institution they worked for. During the Bleach period, when the members of Nirvana were on the road so much that they didn't have places of their own, they often slept on Body's floor, and when they played Seattle, like many I spoke to, Body exploded with joy over the memory that Kurt in those days. He would come over and put on an ABBA's Greatest Hits album, followed by a Partridge Family album, and then play the Vaselines, and then the beat happening, and to us, that was a party. Kurt stood out for more of the boisterous grunge rockers. He was always sweet, always hypersensitive, Tennant says. Kurt was really sweet and kind and really funny. His humor was a crazy mixture of goofy sarcastic with a sharp wit. And recalling that Kurt's 25 years later, Tennant honestly adds, he was exceedingly compassionate and a loyal friend. He was a well-read and true artist, both in music and in art disciplines. I will miss him for the rest of my days. Nirvana's initial sub-release was the cover of Love Buzz, and by the Dutch band Shocking Blue. Love Buzz had become their first single in the Sub Pop Singles Club, a brilliant scheme to help the label's cash flow. Members initially paid $35 a year and were mailed a single per month. The price was raised to $40 a year in 1990, by which the time they had 2,000 subscribers. The early Nirvana singles got enough attention that the album was soon scheduled. Thurston Moore met Bruce Pavitt just before Sub Pop stated putting on records, and he loved one of the first singles, Mudhoney's Touch Me I'm Sick. So he was predisposed to give Sub Pop's artists the benefit of the doubt. Susan Sasek was designed the sleeve for Love Buzz, who had previously sold the merch for Sonic Youth on the road, and in the summer of 1989 she was working at the Pier Platter Records in Hoboken and suggested that Kim and Thurston catch Nirvana's debut show at Maxwell's. She told me that Nirvana was not as good as Mudhoney. Thurston remembers, but they're kind of interesting. So it was me and Suzanne and Kim and Jay Mascis of Dinosaur Jr., and it was a Tuesday night, and there was only one of us around, but there was 20 people there. And from the first notes Nirvana played, Thurston immediately felt that they were amazing, and he went and stood in front of the stage. And at the end of the set, Chad kicking his drums over, Grohl would not become the drummer for another year, and Chris Novoselic throwing his bass across the stage, and Kurt starts slamming his guitar onto the stage, and everything shambles. Jay and I are looking at each other going like, whoa, I hope these guys don't have a gig tomorrow, because that's ridiculous. They smashed everything, but they were just great. After the show, Thurston, Kim, and Jay hung out with Nirvana, and Jay was talking about how going to Seattle and starting a band with Donna Dresch and some of the people from the Screaming Trees. And Kurt said, "Don't do that. Join Ibarn instead." I thought it was a pretty audacious thing to say, and at this point Dinosaur Jr. had already released 3 albums, and Masakis was much more than an established artist in the indie world than Kurt was. Sub Pop rarely spent more than $1,000 recording an album, and Nirvana's Bleach would cost more than $600. Sub Pop. Singles and album were produced by Jack and Dino at Reciprocal Studios in Seattle. Most of the songs on Bleach had a hard rock intensity evocative of the Melvins or Mudhoney, but the album was also included About a Girl, Kurt's first Nirvana song with a pop melody and chorus. Thurston usually speaks in a measured cerebral tone, but he choked up and recalled hearing Bleach for the first time. I thought it was a fantastic sounding record. It hit certain things that I was really wanting to hear in the ways that not many bands were doing, and there were not too many experiences in my life where a record hit all the points that I was waiting for, and I thought it was primal. The songs and the writing was completely melodious, and it was punk, and it was a beauty to it. I really loved that record. When Sonic Youth and the mastering of their debut Geffen record, Goo, Thurston Moore played Bleach for master disc engineer Howie Weinberg and said, "If our record can sound like this, I'd really be happy." The engineer gave him a look of incredulity for wanting to emulate such a primitive recording. Thurston realized it was an all-vibe thing. It didn't really matter what the technology was. It was a magic in what the group was coming off of that record, and primarily the magic is in Kurt's voice. And if anybody else is singing in that band with those songs, it would not have flown the way that it flew. His voice transcends everything. Sonic Youth selected Nirvana as their support act on several West Coast dates, and Thurston recalls they did Las Vegas, Portland, and Seattle, and the interim drummer was Dale Crover from the Melvins. They were good, and the audience knew they were good, but it wasn't Nirvana fever yet. One of Sub Pop's most effective ideas in the fact that they would fly Everett True from London to Seattle in early 1989 to cover the punk scene in the Northwest, and at this point Nirvana had released only one single, but Everett recognized their uniqueness and featured them heavily in the piece for the influential British weekly Melody Maker, which put the Northwestern indie rock on the international media stage for the first time. Soon after Bleach was released, Poneman realized that Nirvana needed some help on the road, and their sound had introduced them to was the Seattle engineer Craig Montgomery, who had worked with them in several labels and other bands. Montgomery remembers, "The first thing I noticed was how catchy the music was. They had good songs and the guy who could really sing, which a lot of the so-called grunge bands didn't. And even before I'd seen the band, people in Seattle told me that he could sing like Creedence singer John Fogerty, and I saw my job as connecting Kurt's voice to the audience." Almost immediately, Kurt became attracted to having the sound man on the road with them, and for the next several years Montgomery worked at every Nirvana show, and at the start it was the 4 of us and Chris Dodge Van going onto these punk rock clubs across the country, he says. And from those early days of Nirvana's career, even when there were only fans, those immersed in the punk rock subculture, their early singles were loud and aggressive, and the seeds of Kurt's impending vision of hybrid punk-pop sound were evident. Chris says that in addition to listening to music from the punk rockers, they would play cassettes of Roy Orbison and the Smithereens or the Beatles, and Montgomery concurs that a lot of the time they would listen to these cheesy pop music. Montgomery soon realized that besides the music, the members of Nirvana were connected to by humor, and at concerts, a lot of what they were doing was taking the piss out of rock and roll, and they could blow up rock cliches sometimes just by the way that they would look at each other or move on stage. It was like they were letting the audience in on the joke, smashing their equipment at once, a homage and critique to fit into this attitude. The sound man remembers Kurt affectionately. He was always funny and smart, witty, sarcastic guy. Usually fun to be around for sure. He was sometimes quiet and needing alone time, but he lived playing the shows. At the time, Sub Pop was distributed by Carolina Records, which was also based in New York City. Janet Billig Rich was also a punk aficionado who started working at the Caroline as a publicist, an AR person, while also a student at the NYU. And since the Sub Pop had no East Coast staff, she would represent the label when their bands played New York. The bands could never afford hotel rooms, so many of them stayed at Janet's apartment in the East Village at the corner of the 17th Street and Avenue C. It was 450 square feet, but it had a loft bed, and with futons, I could squeeze 8 people in there. Thus, there was no problems in partying up 3 members of Nirvana and Montgomery on their initial New York visits beginning in 1989. Janet immediately recognized that Kurt was the first among equals. Bands had to load their gear into her apartment because the van was likely to be broken into in that neighborhood. The first time Nirvana stayed there, Janet also needed help moving some mattresses. Kurt looked at her with an amused expression and said that Kristen Chad Channing, Nirvana's drummer at the time, would do that. And Kurt lay down on my bed and ate a box of cookies. Kristen Chad knew the drill. Kurt wasn't going to get his hands dirty. When I told Chris the story, he rushed to Kurt's defense. When he had to do it, he would haul his own gear. The grim procession, we call it. Similar to the experience I would have a couple of years later, Janet realization of Kurt's magic kicked in when she saw Nirvana on stage. She was blown away by how hard the band drove themselves. I went with them to the Philly show and to the Amherst College show. Afterward, they would always say it was the shittiest show, and they would be dissecting the show and talking about how crappy they were, even when the people would be coming backstage saying they were amazing. To me, every show was emotional and so raw, and they have always wanted themselves to have been better. She saw why Kurt was so beloved by the punk community. He came from nowhere and had nothing, and that's where his connection to the punk ethos came from. But from the time that she met him to the time that she saw him live, Kurt was also ambitious. He straddled both the worlds, and the college radio stations played Nirvana from the beginning, and the coterie of the critics who focused on the punk rock single of the band to the point that they were soon able to develop a small cult following outside of the Pacific Northwest. Besides, the indies like SST and Sub Pop were risking much less money because they were rarely afforded to pay the lawyers, and they usually also didn't have long-term contracts. However, at the beginning of 1989, midway through recording Bleach, Kurt and Chris had decided that they wanted to have a contract with their label. Evidently, it signed legitimately to have Kurt at the moment before he had learned much about the business. Poneman didn't have a simple template for a contract because none of their artists had ever asked for one before, and so he cobbled one together. And at the time, Kurt felt that a contract represented more of a commitment from Sub Pop. And the way things turned out, it was a label that would benefit from it. And within that contract, Sub Pop would not have been in the position to make millions of dollars from Nirvana when they moved to Geffen. I regret the role I was destined to play in the band's career, precluded by my getting to know Poneman and Pavitt more superficially. Kurt never begrudged by them the money that they ultimately made from Nirvana after they changed labels. Not only did Bleach sell hundreds of thousands of albums in the wake of Nirvana's commercial breakthrough, Sub Pop got an override of royalty on Nevermind that was worth millions of dollars, and the profits of Nirvana's recordings allowed them to sell half of the company to Warner Music to reported $20 million in 1995. The Sub Pop put out of Nirvana's original singles first album they put new guitars that Kurt smashed on stage. They introduced him to Craig Montgomery, Janet Billig, and Everett True. Among others, there were many stories that Poneman tell of the journalists and musicians that Nirvana was going to be their biggest band. However, the Sub Pop partners were also the proponents of the indie exceptionalism, and the first time the issue of his fanzine Sub Pop's Pavitt had written, when people buy a record, they're not only plugging into the music, but they're plugging into the values and the lifestyle that are implied by the artist. And by supporting a huge Hollywood music corporations, yes, you are not only allowing middle-aged capitalists to dictate what goes on in the airwaves, but you are giving them the go-ahead to promote macho pig-fuck bands whose entire lifestyle revolves around cocaine, sexism, money, and more money. In the 80s, new need for sound is as much a new need for heroes. This sort of rhetoric didn't ultimately affect what Kurt did with his career, but it did resonate with many of the artists. And in her memoir, Hungry Makes Me a modern girl, Carrie Brownstein, whose band Slater Keeney recorded for the Kill Rock Stars, noted what the abulant treatise about what's selling out could be found in designs like the Punk Rock Planet or the Maximum Rock and Roll. Upon returning to America after their first European tour, Nirvana recorded demos of Lithium, In Bloom, and Polly, which would end up on their most memorable songs on Nevermind. Later on, after Nevermind became successful, some writers observed the earlier indie bands like the Pixies or the Replacements or Husker Du had combined some of the elements of the punk rock attitude with more traditional choruses and melodies. But I always felt that the comparisons missed the point. Those bands never wrote the songs that actually became big radio hits like Kurt did. Songs that worked up on the top 40 radio stations as well as on the rock radio, and Kurt's bigger hits also had complicated lyrics and raw emotions that were rarely found on the pop radio. And how and when did he figure out how to do this? Musical mythology notwithstanding, there is nothing in the lyrics of Robert Johnson's classic blues song Crossroads to indicate that he sold his soul to the devil in return for his talent. The persistence of the myth that the invocation to describe the transformation of the later giants such as Jimi Hendrix and Bob Dylan has, I think, a motto to do with this mysteries of genius than the sinister occult arrangements. There are not many in the rock and roll chords. Every lyricist has access to the same dictionary. Everyone can listen to the same canon. Some elements of the craftsmanship of pop songwriting can be taught, and not the art of getting the listeners in touch with their deepest feelings in an instantly memorable way. Some maintain the mass success in rock and roll is mostly a matter of luck, timing, and marketing, and intensity of ambition. And however, when it comes to Kurt, I think it has more to do with the way that Sonny Rollins described the music of John Coltrane in the documentary Chasing Train. To play the level that you have been touched by, whatever, for my generation, the greatest rock savant was Bob Dylan. Bob Johnson, the producer of these albums, Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde, said Dylan, God didn't touch him on the shoulder. He kicked him in the ass. There was nothing that he could do about it. He got the Holy Spirit on him, and you can look at him and tell that. I believe that Kurt too was touched by whatever at an early age, and was kicked in the ass by the Spirit, and he knew it. I suspect that Chris knew it from this outset of their relationship as well. And of course, feeling the success was inside him. Having it play out was the mass scale virtually overnight has two different things. The demo of the new songs were produced by Butch Vig, who lived in Madison, Wisconsin, where he was known for making it inexpensive but excellent-sounding records for punk bands in his studios, Smart Studios. Vig had recently produced the Smashing Pumpkins' debut album Gish, which went on to sell a couple 100,000 copies and was basking in the afterglow of their breakout. Record producers play different roles for different artists, and for many pop, country, R&B, and commercial pop and rock records, producers pick material and arrangements, often masking an artistic contribution that is almost equal to that of the artist. However, on recordings by rock auteurs who write their own material, such as R.E.M. and U2 and Nirvana, producers play a limited role, but are nonetheless crucial in supporting the characters in the creation of an album. They are responsible for the sound, and the best producers also help the artists be creative with their choices. Some, like Vig, also are audio engineers, physically in control the console in the studio during the recording. He had found most of Bleach to be one-dimensional, but Vig was blown away by the evolution in Kurt's songwriting. He had an innate pop sensibility for the melody and phrasing. At some time, he felt hindered by what you're supposed to be in a punk rock band, and he had an amazing affinity for melodies and hooks. These sessions were also Vig's first observed Kurt's mood swings. The first day that Kurt was funny and engaged and chatty and in good spirits. Then after that we got some sounds on drums, and Kurt sat down in the corner and put his head down, and I asked if he needed anything, and he didn't even answer. Chris pulled me aside and said he gets that way sometimes. He needs to chill, and then he'll snap out of it. And after another 20 minutes, Kurt got up and picked up his guitar and said, "Let's go," and fully engaged. And at first, the band anticipated that these songs would go on to a second Sub Pop album, but once they were back on the road, they reevaluated the situation and decided to hold off. Kurt later told me The touring gave a wider perspective on the future possibilities. Montgomery remembers them talking in the van about what to do next, and then they were really unhappy about what, despite the interest of Bleach was generating, Sub Pop didn't seem to be able to get their record into the stores. Slim Moon remembers that Kurt complaining that Mudhoney was getting all the love and the marketing from Sub Pop, and Kurt was irritated by the article in the Los Angeles Times where Poneman was quoted as describing all the Sub Pop bands as lumberjacks, and Kurt told the Rocket, "I feel like we've been tagging in illiterate redneck cousin fucking kids who have no idea what's going on," and that's completely untrue. Moreover, Chris says in Seattle that were the rumors that Sub Pop was going to affiliate with a major, and recalls that the band decided, if we're going to be a part of the system anyway, we'd rather have a direct relationship. And in my opinion, none of these reasons really crystallized Nirvana's resolve to Sub Pop. I think that Kurt had long been interested in a stronger reach with marketing power into major record companies, and he had developed a greater comfort level with the idea of touring with Sonic Youth, whose credibility hadn't been hurt in the slightest in their decision to sign with Geffen, and with the increased visibility of Seattle scene in general, and Bleach in particular, majors who have ignored Nirvana a year earlier were buying them dinner, and Kurt was intrigued. There was some in the indie punk world who intensely resented Nirvana's immigration to a major label, and it reminded me of the same betrayal felt by the same Southern Christians decades earlier, and Sam Cooke and Ray Charles had abandoned gospel music for the rhythm and blues, or the way that some folk fans in the 60s freaked out when Bob Dylan went electric. However, Kurt was going to be deterred from pursuing the destiny that he had long envisioned for himself. He had no persistence. He had no patience for indie purist guilt trips. He later explained to Azarad a band was in a situation where it expected to fight in a revolutionary sense against the corporate machine. And I just thought, how dare you put that kind of pressure on me? It's really stupid. He was on a different mission. And that is the end of chapter 3. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you over in chapter 4.